Good evening. Thank you all for joining us virtually this evening. I'm Nicole Mardell, a board member of Building a Better Bend. While we're sad we had to move this presentation online, we're so grateful to our speakers, sponsors, and attendees for being flexible and making sure this important presentation continues. Building a Better Bend is a nonprofit organization founded nearly 20 years ago with the mission of bringing expert speakers to share their experiences and ways to positively affect the quality of development in Bend. Our free annual lecture series wouldn't be possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Our co-title sponsors for this year's lecture series are Hayden Homes and Pahlisch Homes. Hayden Homes and Pahlisch Homes are proud to sponsor the Building a Better Bend series. Both home builders believe that to solve our region's housing crisis, we need to start with education and collaboration. We must understand the problem so that together we can create innovative solutions. Hayden Homes and Pahlisch Homes have been committed to bettering our community for over 35 years. They bring their collaborative spirit to public-private partnerships just like this one. With the Building a Better Bend series, these local home builders hope to inspire and involve community members to action. Bend continues to grow, and both Hayden Homes and Pahlisch Homes believe that Bend can set the standard for the state on what healthy growth can look like without hindering affordability as we meet the demands for housing. Thank you both for your support and commitment. Tonight's presenting sponsor is Pinnacle Architecture, who you'll hear from in a few moments. Our other presenting and supporting sponsors include Ashley & Vance Engineering, Central Oregon Landwatch, Miller Lumber, Cascadia Partners, Killian Pacific, and Scotia Group. Thank you to each of these fantastic organizations. Additionally, we have a delightfully long list of partners for this year's series, including Project, Walker Macy, Echo Northwest, Palmer Homes, DKS Associates, Dowell, Kittleson & Associates, CEA Consulting Engineers, Calcon, Sunwest Builders, COIC, Hand in Hand Productions, Stemich Design and Architecture, 10 Over Studios, KPFF, First Interstate Bank, and LRS Architects. Thank you all so much for your support. I'd now like to introduce Peter Baer, President of Pinnacle Architecture and Building a Better Bend board member. We are grateful to Pinnacle for being the presenting sponsor for tonight's event, and he will introduce tonight's topic and speakers. And with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Hello, everyone. I'm Peter Baer, the founder of Pinnacle Architecture. On behalf of our entire team, I want to thank you for being here today. We're incredibly proud to sponsor this event as it aligns deeply with our mission of enhancing lives and communities, which we have been doing for over 3 decades. At Pinnacle, our journey in affordable housing began with creating spaces that provide not just shelter, but dignity and inspiration for the residents. Over time, we recognized that our role didn't end with the architectural plans. We've been advocates, partners, and community members in the larger conversation about housing. Whether it's fighting for policy changes or advising developers, nonprofits, and government agencies how good design impacts their lives. This lecture is one more step in that ongoing commitment. We all know that Oregon is facing a housing crisis, and today is about focusing on solutions, about how we as a community come together and turn the tide. Where will we live as Bend continues to grow in both size and popularity? Where will our teachers and firefighters live? Where will our children and grandchildren live? We decided to put our focus on housing this year, on identifying the key factors behind our housing crisis, on innovative solutions and housing types for our communities to explore, and how to come together to support these efforts. In the first lecture, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, with Dr. Greg Colburn, he presented his research on the correlation between homelessness and housing market conditions, namely high rents and low vacancy rates, demonstrating that homelessness is an issue primarily caused by our housing market. In the second lecture, Innovative Housing Solutions, we heard from Michael Elison of Larch Lab and Mark Fretz of the University of Oregon on their work with technology and design innovations such as modular flat pack and mass timber housing kits, as well as advocacy for building code changes for point access block development. a necessary deep dive into housing construction for those of us in the development world. Our final lecture this evening, Coming Together for Housing, is focused on the enigmatic issues that come into play with housing development. Our cultural issues and public fear can limit our ability to make meaningful change. The information provided throughout the lecture series provides us with an excellent base of information. But without community support, innovations in housing policy and development can often stall. We'll learn this evening how we can come together to address these issues and turn this housing crisis around. Our first speaker may be well known to many online tonight. Katy Brooks is the CEO of Bend Chamber of Commerce. Her vision for the Chamber is to catalyze an environment where businesses, their employees, and the community thrive. The Chamber supports a collaborative business environment and leads efforts to resolve tough issues like the affordable housing and child care shortage, assisting businesses with resources and advocating for businesses at the local and state level. Our second speaker, Clark Anderson, is co-founder and executive director of Community Builders. He has spent the last 15 years helping communities address complex land use, transportation, housing, and economic development challenges. An entrepreneur, seasoned facilitator, and bridge builder, he's adept at helping people find common ground through informed dialogue and meaningful public engagement. Clark helps communities create a shared vision for the future and identify the strategies and partnerships needed to get there. And he's also a developer focused on building missing middle housing in his own community. Please welcome Katy and Clark.
Thanks, Peter. It's so great being here tonight. Hello, everybody. Hi, Clark. I can see you on the other screen. We have a lot to talk about tonight. I was asked to get us kicked off with kind of setting the scene of what's happening with the state of Oregon, with the governor's agenda from the 24 session and looking into the 2025 session, and also talking a little bit about what the city of Bend and Deschutes County are up to as far as trying to resolve the housing crisis that we have in Bend and Central Oregon. So I'm with the Bend Chamber. We do a heck of a lot of work on this since about 2020, 2021. We've been working on advocacy. We've been making investments in the community in mid-market housing. We've been doing a social media program to try and educate each other on why we need a full spectrum of folks who can live and work here, both. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And what I'd like to do is kick it off with the overall statewide picture. So back in 2024, the legislative session, as you all remember, really focused on housing. And if you recall, Senate Bill 1537 was the governor's housing bill. And she had a lot of plans that she wanted to accomplish last session, and a lot of it did come to fruition. Senate Bill 1537 was the housing production bill. It established Housing Production Accountability Office, the HAPO office, which is really overseeing a lot of the strategies that are being implemented as we speak. And it directs the review of infrastructure needs, whether or not we're expanding the urban growth boundaries in certain communities, and it created an expedited one-time 100-acre UGB that we're actually using here in Bend to expand, hopefully, later on this year, early next, as a discussion in City Council. So that was a $75 million piece at the very end that also included some money for qualifying cities that could create more moderate income housing as well. So that was all in one package in Senate Bill 1537. Now, Senate Bill 1530, that was the funding implementation of those agenda items. So this was the omnibus housing funding bill. It was the companion bill, and it was $279 million of housing investments, including $89 million of specific allocations for housing related to infrastructure projects. So we all know that some of our communities here receive some of that funding: Redmond, Madras, Prineville, and Culver. Bend wasn't on that list, and we're hoping it will be in the 2025 section, and you'll hear more on that this coming year. So $65 million was also for the homeless shelter operational funding and $36.5 million for transitional housing. That was all part of the 2024 session. Now, as we move forward, there's some overall themes that the governor's office is focusing on. Implementation of what we have found out with the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, maximizing our funding for affordable housing, renting, ownership, both, and expanding state housing production programs, reforms, and tools. And to get that accomplished, there are several things that are included. She calls them the pillars of housing production, and that's her agenda for the 2025 session. So the governor's office is monitoring and assessing statewide housing production outcomes. As you recall, last year, the target was 36,000 homes per year. We want to see how close we are to meeting that mark, and we'll be hearing more about that as we go into the 25 session. The other pillar is maintaining existing housing investments. So that's preserving and stabilizing existing affordable housing and affordable housing through acquisition. That means getting more housing for public, private, and non-governmental or nonprofit partnerships to bring those housing costs down through those partnerships. The third pillar is land use and readiness. So this is support for that one-time UGB expansion that I mentioned earlier, that the City of Bend is going through an RFP process, request for proposal, to find a successful bidder to go and develop some additional acreage and bump out our UGB. It expands land acquisition programs so that we can do more of the creative problem-solving development of housing with our non-government and public partners and private partners, and then to recapitalize brownfield or fallow and underdeveloped and sometimes contaminated lands that we can clean up and bring back to life and redevelop. The fourth pillar, reduce complexity and costs for housing. That's a pretty big order. And it identifies a process that looks at the barriers that developers and builders really face in trying to bring this housing stock online. It includes overhauling or re-examining the permitting process. And then this focus is going to be on middle housing as well. And that's going to include duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, and cottage clusters. Now, we got on board with that a little bit earlier here in Bend, but as a statewide effort, this is something that they're going to monitor and trying to implement, and they're a couple of years behind where Bend is right now. So the fifth pillar is funding for housing programs. So this is going to be in the governor's budget, and this is pairing up and maximizing federal low-income housing and other funds, and explore a dedicated time-limited revenue stream that lasts about 10 years for low and moderate housing development. So that is something the governor's office will try to establish this year. Secondly, a program for new affordable and moderate income housing development for transportation infrastructure. So we all know a big hidden cost that most folks don't think about when you're expanding your UGB or just building out new areas of town, is that the infrastructure is one of the biggest costs to bringing those homes online. So this revolving loan program that the governor would like to establish can help resolve some of those issues statewide. And then we'll explore changes for Oregon Housing and Community Servicing financing programs. So it would be housing is better supported. The sixth housing is housing workforce. So that sixth pillar is really important because these are the folks that do the work behind the scenes. They're not only building, but they're permitting, they're working with the cities, the counties, and it's the infrastructure of people that bring housing online. So that is a quick landscape of state. Local housing, the City of Bend has been working on housing policy improvement for many years now. Lately, they've done a couple of interesting things and taken a little bit of creativity into their policy by introducing what they're calling a tiny TIF. It's tax increment financing, and it's for small areas. And it establishes a Bend urban renewal agency or area where developers can get a tax reimbursement if they meet certain criteria. And that's a 12-year benefit of a rebate every year of that tax increment of what the additional worth of your land would be as opposed to what the existing use is. So you would get that back as a developer if 15%, minimum of 15% of those units are below 90% AMI accessible, area mean income accessible. And you can add more years to that as a rebate if you do things like add more affordable housing or use electrification or other sustainability efforts and other pluses that will bring you more rebates for a longer period of time should you embark on that. There is also a tiny TIF for commercial job generation as well that goes along with it. City of Bend also received a pro-housing grant. Now that's a $5 million federal HUD grant that they received. We celebrated this over the summer, and that will enhance affordable housing accessibility through planning, infrastructure improvements, development, and preservation activities. We're really excited to see them implement that over the next couple of years. Now, Deschutes County also has a program. This year they approved the $30,000 builder credit, the home fund. So that goes to builders who price homes that are 80 to 120%, so mid-market AMI affordability to a buyer that has to be employed within Deschutes County. And this is a deed restriction, so it's for 20 years. If that property gets resold, it's got to be sold under those same parameters. So they'll have to have a job here and they'll have to earn that AMI range. So that will perpetuate over the next 20 years. And hopefully we'll figure all this stuff out in 20 years and we won't need this anymore. We can be hopeful on that. So those are some of the things that are going on right now with state and city and also county efforts. It's a lot going on, a lot of focus, but I'm really excited that Clark's here with us because we all know there are challenges. There are challenges in our culture and our community in bringing in density. There are obstacles to permitting and to bringing this housing online with the cost of land. And there's a lot of community anxiety over this issue of, do we have enough housing? Will we have enough housing to support a well-rounded, healthy community? And Clark is here to talk to us about his work in that area specifically. And I'm really glad you're here, Clark. Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry for the delay in saying thank you and had to unmute there. Boy, I wish I was there in person with you all. I was very excited to come and participate and visit Bend. But the fall cold season got the best of me, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to try to move this online. So I think this will still be really fun. And Katie, thank you for all of that introduction. I have to say, it's really impressive what you all are doing, and the level of effort is really clear. And so the way you I think positioned the discussion tonight is a good one, which is that as we try to advance these different strategies and programs and solutions, how do we do that in a way where we're coming together as a community, where we can actually build the needed community and political support to be successful? So excited to explore that with you today. And I've seen some of the great previous talks you've had, and I know you all have learned a lot. So I'm hoping to keep some of this kind of discussion oriented. I'm going to ask a question. I think, I don't know that just a quick question on technology here. Are people able to put chat or comments in, or is that not possible?
Yeah, they can actually, nobody can hear me talking, but yeah, they absolutely can put questions in the chat and we'll get to those at the end if you want to repeat that.
Great. So it sounds like that will work. And I just want to, warm up with a pretty basic question, I think, for all of you guys. But why is housing getting harder to afford? I mean, again, pretty sophisticated group here, I think. And maybe I can't get the answers to those comments right now, right? Or can you see anything coming?
Unfortunately, I don't have it piped back to you. I'm
Oh, that's okay. All right. So, in lieu of kind of hearing some of those concepts as they come in, I'll just walk through some of what I'm sure a lot of you guys would be saying. There's a gap between prices and incomes. There's a lack of supply and diversity. There's increasing land and development costs, higher costs of entry for home ownership, price escalation, particularly in higher end markets. And each of these, the reason I wanted to begin with this is because each of these calls for specific types of solutions. And again, if you look at what you guys are putting together from a policy framework, it's pretty impressive that you're tackling these things. So when we then ask the next question, what can we do about it? The simple answer is that we actually know. We know a lot about what we need to do to tackle this problem. We understand the need to improve our policies. We know that we need to have plans that make it clear where we want housing, what type of housing we want. We know that we need to align those plans across policy and infrastructure investments. We know that our policies need to be responsive to those plans. We know that we need to look at the creation of local funding to help us bridge the gap between what the market will create and what will work in terms of affordable below market housing. And all of the things that we could imagine in terms of the tools and programs are actually being done at the local level. So in a way, while we like to think about what we can do about it, I think sometimes the real question is, why are the solutions we're advancing not sufficient to the challenge? And I think this, again, were we in person, I would hope this would elicit a short conversation, but I'll go ahead and engage in the conversation myself. I think one of the things we can learn as we look at the challenge of making these types of programs and policies work at the local level is that we're not lacking for technical solutions. We're not lacking for financial strategies. We understand how to do it. The real thing that's getting in our way is ourselves and the difficulty of creating sufficient community buy-in and political will to make meaningful substantive change, because it's very clear that the solutions that we're creating, as solid as they are, and as much as we need to celebrate the success that we are having, it's not enough. And we know that it's not enough because we can see that year after year, even though communities across the country, like Bend, are following the lessons from other places and cobbling together great strategies and investing in new programs, and we're still getting further and further behind. At least I can say that is the case for here where I live in Glenwood Springs. So I want to start a little bit with a sort of story of my community that I think draws this out a little bit. So this is the small city of Glenwood Springs. We're a town of a little over 10,000 people in a larger region that's connected to the larger kind of Vail, Aspen amenity region. We have a very significant jobs and housing imbalance for the workforce and the people that work up in jobs up in the resort communities. And there's, because of that, a very significant commuter challenge and people spending much of their time in their cars. And we have associated with that a lot of traffic and challenges around growth, more as a region than as just these communities where the jobs are. And so it's probably very familiar, but more in a linear sense to what you guys experience there in Bend. And so what I can say that I'm proud about my community for is we've actually done in the last decade a lot of work, in terms of the planning, the policy work, putting the pieces together. And the proof for me is in the pudding, in the sense that, this is a small missing middle project that I built. I'm actually sitting in the lower level of that right now in a little co-working space. And it's very modest, but this was a 9-unit mixed use sort of co-work with residential that we built. My wife and I were just little mom and pop developers. And the things that made it possible, the city's comprehensive plan was clear. We wanted more housing in the downtown. The policy alignment was good because in terms of things like parking, there were incentives for fees that made it so that we could actually dedicate multiple units into below market units for Glenwood workers. And so, without going into details of the project beyond that, I'll just say, all of the things worked. And it's a small example of what's possible, but it wasn't nearly enough. And so, fortunately, we also recognized that one of our big problems was a lack of dedicated funding to be able to tackle the problem. So here again, the community began organizing. We, along with others, worked to create a new, an addition to our lodging tax to help fund workforce and affordable housing. It actually passed. And suddenly we had money to be able to put into financing the gap for affordable housing projects. So a success, right? We're making progress.
Hey, Clark, can I interrupt you real quick? For some reason,
Yes.
I'm not seeing your screen share right now. Can you?
Yeah, I'll share. Oh, you guys are just looking at me, not these slides.
There we go. Now I can see it. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Well, okay. So here's the project I was mentioning. Money for affordable housing. And yet, here's the conundrum. This is a $110 million, it looks like a bridge, I know. It is a bridge. It's a new bridge. We built this. This is the grand opening of the Grand Avenue Bridge in Glen. And while it was fundamentally a transportation project, I think of it as an affordable housing project. Because despite our best efforts as a community and as a region, we're still not even close. To the degree that we had to spend, well over $100 million on this new bridge to be able to make it easier for the people who can't afford to live in our communities, in the places, even close to the places where they work. So, and yet one of the big challenges we talk about, we don't have the resources, we don't have the technical know-how. Well, doing all of this, making this bridge happen is a clear sign that we do. But what we're lacking is the political will to tackle the problem at scale in our communities in this region. And so we're willing to expand a highway through a downtown, spend, again, over $100 million of funding to create something like this, and yet not willing to tackle the problem that's right in front of us. And more recently, this becomes clearer and more evident. This is the Confluence. It was a project that was proposed by Habitat for Humanity. This was a modest 8-unit project on a small piece of infill property. And this was one that finally brought the community unglued after all of those things that I mentioned in terms of progress. And by unglued, I mean that the community actually organized because there was opposition. That opposition expanded rapidly, and there became a citizen petition on the ballot, which took away many of our most useful affordable housing tools within a matter of months. And so the question then becomes, what happened where there was this community that seemed to be making progress, but really wasn't? And I think part of what it is that we hadn't actually done the real work to bring our community along to get to where we needed to go to tackle this type of problem. And so I think we're all familiar with the pushback and nature of opposition. But when we think about this in a purely kind of us versus them, NIMBYism type of framework, we're not doing enough to really understand and tackle the problem. So I think we have to appreciate the larger context. And, this is a time when it's getting much more difficult to make good decisions. And there's a lot of pressures on our communities. The changes that we're facing are significant. And our ability to connect with one another is affected. If we can look at this at a national scale, we are seeing a growing divide within our communities. This is a lot of, I'm not going to expect you to actually see all of the data here, but the story here is that, ongoing longitudinal research from Pew just demonstrates how we are becoming more and more disconnected in our communities and more divisive between one another. And that is making it harder. That's contributing to this. But the reality is, even as we become more partisan nationally and we feel that at the local level, these challenges are also very, very much locally rooted. But what is also contributing to this is we do live in a media ecosystem, media ecosystem where facts are increasingly hard to arrive at and to agree upon. We are incentivized, and the platforms we use and people use for news are incentivized to to get us riled up. And so increasingly, it's harder and harder for people who live in our communities to make sense of information. And so as they experience these changes, they're becoming more fearful. So all of the types of national division, the media climate we're in, and the pace of change in our communities all are contributing to these dynamics. And at the most fundamental level, too, we do need to do better when it comes to community engagement. So these are sort of the dynamics that are working within our communities that we have to sort of ask ourselves a question. You know, we can either work around these dynamics with avoidant engagement, which is typical. It's the type of engagement where we try to work around the people that we don't want to engage or we're fearful of. We can make, we can invest in project or policy specific advocacy. We can organize against the opposition. And all of this is going to have to be a part of what we're doing in the near term. But long term, it's forcing us to play into an us versus them game, and we're not creating a type of civic capacity that's going to let us move forward. So we can work on these dynamics instead through what we call civic capacity. And civic capacity is the ability of a community to understand where we are today and make good decisions together about the future that we want. It includes critical elements like leadership, community engagement, community vision, partnerships and collaboration, and the systems we need to create good decisions, communications and media. And these are all really critical components of what we integrate into our process, which I'm going to talk a little bit about our process framework as a way to just sort of see how some of these things can be utilized in actual community engagement projects that help build common vision around a direction that we can all move towards. But I also, before we go into that, want to share the sort of conceptual framework of belonging as a really valuable framework for thinking about this issue for a couple different reasons. The idea of belonging is one, and I really like John Powell's work in particular and the way he talks about it, because John Powell talks about belonging both in terms of our ability to bring people together in a way that they feel like they belong. So we think about, the ways that we've been structurally in our society for a long time. There's been exclusion, and then we worked hard to move towards more inclusion, but inclusion isn't always enough because you can be included without feeling comfortable, without actually feeling heard, without actually feeling recognized. So the next step from above that is, how do we make it so people all truly feel like they belong, like they're part of something, like they are co-creating together the future for their community? And I think this is a useful framework, both because it provides a way for us to think about the processes we need, which are going to need to include really working together and co-creating the future we want. And then also the outcomes that we are going to seek, because we can't truly create places of belonging without addressing the structural challenge that get in the way of that. So in my valley, in our community, we can't truly make Glenwood or the Roaring Fork Valley where I live a place of belonging without addressing housing and our transportation needs and all of the related components of that at a level where people actually truly can belong. Because just doing better community engagement, where we're making it so that the people who have to commute, down valley to work can come and participate, but they still have to go down valley to sleep at night, that's not real belonging, right? So the question is, how do we make it so people can truly belong in terms of addressing the structural deficits to belonging as well? There's some great concepts and content in here for people, and really important ones also are thinking about bridging and bonding. And we'll go into a little bit of that in talking about sort of our approach within our on-the-ground work with communities. John Powell and Stephen Menendian talk about sort of 4 key elements of belonging that I think are also helpful for us to keep in mind as we think about this type of work. I think we're familiar with the idea of inclusion, but it also takes connection and the idea that we actually need proximity. We need to actually connect with people. And this is a big part of the idea of how we can bridge with one another and talk to and engage with people who are different from us across lines of difference. And that difference isn't always what we think of it as. It isn't always racial or socioeconomic or age. We have a lot of different identities. And one of the things that is challenging when we are sort of just focused on inclusion alone is we sort of forget about the multiple identities we have, and we focus actually in on our identities. It actually asks us to sort of say, let's first identify the identities we need at the table instead of saying we all have many identities. And so let's create opportunities for connection across the things that we share. And that focuses us less on how we're different and more on how we're the same. Recognition is the idea that we need to be seen and heard, but it's a more, a less ableist way of saying, because not everybody can be seen or heard, but we all need to be recognized. We need to feel like not only are we included, not only do we feel connected, but we're recognized. Our ideas have been listened to. What we want to say has had its chance to come out. And then we also need, and this is the most important element, agency. People need to feel that they have the capacity to affect change, to help shape the future of the community that they live within. And the reality is the processes that we use for the most part to guide our planning and policy today does not do this very well, right? Very often we're using expert consultants, which play an important role, but we're asking other people to come in and answer our questions for us and solve our problems for us. And so this concept of agency asks of us that we create the capacity to actually solve our problems ourselves. And that's a real shift from how we've been doing things. Another really important component of this work and the idea of belonging, both what we do and also John Powell's framework, is the idea of story. And story is really important because the way that we see the world, the way we interact with one another, is most fundamentally influenced by the stories we tell ourselves. In fact, the structure of our society, the way that we engage in pretty much all, even the ways we're engaging here tonight, we are living into stories that we tell ourselves. Capitalism is a story. Religion is stories. Our democracy is a story. These are stories that we use to coordinate and organize as a society. And so a story is very, very powerful. And it is a way that we understand ourselves and our place within a larger sense of community or larger community, and understand ourselves in the world. And the challenge we often have today as it pertains to housing and other types of kind of community change is that our stories are often backwards looking. We're often reaching back towards this sort of nostalgic vision for some time that felt much better than. We often, when we actually take a harder look at it, it's not always better for everybody. But there's a sense of nostalgia. We're looking in the rearview mirror. And when we're doing that and thinking about the great way things used to be, of course, we have an entire, political campaign right now that's oriented around the idea of like, let's look at the way things used to be and orient at a story for political action around that. It's backwards looking. And the challenge with something that's backwards looking is we can't do anything about it. And what it does instead is it allows us to begin thinking about the reasons that things aren't as good as they once were. And when we begin doing that, we start pointing fingers and blame, and we other people. And this is, again, where the concept of belonging becomes a really important component of how we can shift the ways that we make decisions, the type of civic capacity that we build to be able to make more meaningful progress on the ground in housing or other types of community development needs. Whereas if we shift towards a positive, forward-looking story, something that we can orient ourselves around, something that can bring us together, something that we can say, this is a story that we're all in. This isn't a story where it was the good old days and some people were doing well and some people weren't, but I'm not in that story. This is a story where we're all part of it. And that is a forward-looking story, and it's something that can galvanize action and bring us together. So I want to share now, sort of taking it down from this higher level into a little bit more of a brass tacks, how does this stuff actually work? This is our community engagement process. I should have begun by saying, we work directly with communities in a partnership where we help communities solve problems, through these types of processes. And this is just one, there's no magic to this, right? It's our framework, and there's a lot, it's flexible. All it provides us is a structure within which we can work with the community and some questions we can orient ourselves around. But I think it's a useful way to sort of understand what we can do better in this type of work in terms of engaging around the ideas of belonging and building civic capacity in the ways that we make decisions. Because again, if the problem isn't technical, if the problem isn't just financial, but it's actually how we're making decisions and how we build community and political support, then it comes down to process questions. So we begin with, and I'm just going to sort of walk through some real fundamental stuff here. We begin with this groundwork phase, which is really a question of, how do we do this? And this is work where before the project even starts, we work with local partners and ask the fundamental questions of what do we want out of this? How's this project going to work? So right now we're working with the city of Leadville and Lake County in Colorado in this phase, and they're going to do a regional vision, and it's going to be used to create their comprehensive plan. We'll help them create the comprehensive plan. And rather than us come in and say, here's the work plan and the exact process we're going to use, they're designing it. They are figuring out what are the questions we need to explore, what's the research we need to do. And so it is right from the beginning that we initiate this concept of co-creation. And the groundwork really is the community level scoping of what the project is going to be. And we do things like create project teams so that we have a team that's going to be working with the community to focus on how we have an effective process and reaching out into the community. I'll talk a little bit about how that works. And we work with them to create that. Those teams, not us, and not just the city and the county, they end up coming in and helping to create the project goals, the ways that we're actually going to measure, are we accomplishing what we set out to do with this project? These are some examples from a project we did in Silverton, which is a small mountain town in Colorado. And that was a project that was really oriented around helping the community come out of a period of very significant division, find a common vision together, and then actually get some specific actions and policies done that they needed to work on. And so these were the goals that they identified as a community to guide their project. And so we would regularly check in on those. And then we need to be thinking about, okay, and this is going to get real tactical here for a few minutes before I bring us back up. But, who do we need to involve and how? I think we all, people who work in community process now have a really good understanding that we need to do a better job of figuring out how do we engage the whole community and do that in a way that is reflective of different needs and the imbalances in access and power that we have. But as a practical matter, we need to look at some really basic things, who is in our community? How can we use that understanding of our demographic profile to help design an effective process? How do we think about the influence and interests that different parts of the community have? And how do we use that to ensure that we're engaging people meaningfully? How do we then lean into and understand the networks we have so that we can reach the people that we need to reach that are difficult to reach and might have a harder time becoming involved? Using an understanding of who are the connectors and leaders so that it's really people in the community that are driving the engagement and we're empowering them to be leaders in that work. So these are sort of processes we go through with the community members that we're working with themselves and the teams that we build in our projects. And then understanding what are the barriers in that particular community to leadership and engagement and participation in the project. So this is actually a barrier assessment that we did with Gunnison County during a recent project where they worked together, and particularly parts of the community that were had the hardest time being involved and were often marginalized, came through and said, these are the things that are most challenging for us. And it is only from there that we can then begin talking about engagement methods. And I just want to take a moment here to talk about how different this is from the typical approach. And I'm not saying it's what we do is magic. I'm just saying when most processes unfold, here's what happens. A local government decides they're going to do a planning process. They have an RFP. They put it out. The consulting firm responds. They respond with a budget and a scope of work. And that scope of work, because it has to be tied to a budget, is going to include some type of community engagement strategy. Usually that's a requirement of the RFP. which sounds fine, except for that you're coming in and you're trying to design a solution before you actually have a clear understanding of what the needs are. And you're designing it without anybody in the community being a part of the process to do it, which takes agency away from them. And so we also typically then end up with, an engagement process that, because out of necessity, is limited in terms of what it's going to cost, because it's part of a much, obviously part of a much larger budget. I understand these are realities we have to work with. I'm not knocking local government for doing it that way, but I'm saying that the way that we've leaned into this as our approach to doing community engagement when we're doing planning processes is leaving certain things behind. And the types of things that it's leaving behind is, one, the ability to work with the community in a more community-driven way of saying, we're going to design and execute this project. And two, we're putting the responsibility of figuring out and answering our problems in the hands of the consulting firms, who are very smart people, but to come in and solve those problems. And those consulting firms can do their work just as well, but under a new paradigm where we ask them to don't come in with the answers, come in as guides and help us, roll up your sleeves with us. You have expertise, help us understand, but let us find the solutions rather than doing more superficial levels of input, 3 workshops, and then roll up all the information and the flip charts and the sticky pads, take them back to your office, write it up and say, here's the strategies, and then spend the rest of your time trying to defend the decisions we got to, which is how most processes go through. So once we've done that, we can finally think about what are the actual methods we're going to use to reach people, how are we going to communicate with them? And all of this is happening in the groundwork phase of the project. So there's a lot of work to do to make sure the project is successful before the project has even launched, including, figuring out how we're going to manage all of that engagement data. So from there, we shift into values. And this is a stage where we're talking about what matters most to us. And we're asking very, very specific questions about what we love most about our community, what our fears and concerns are, and what our hopes and aspirations are. And this is different, very different than asking, what are the issues in your community? Because when you ask somebody, what do you love most about this place? Or what are your fears? It hits you in a different place. And so this is from a project we're doing in the southwestern part of Colorado, an area of Colorado called the west end of Montrose County. They're going through a significant energy transition. They've had some coal plants close or some coal mines close, and they're really struggling with the types of changes they're going through. But it is a very tight-knit community, and they are really, really, I'll just put it this way, when we facilitated these small group values discussions, in every single one, I had people that were tearing up and crying while talking to their neighbors and people in their community. And so it's a very powerful experience, because we're shifting away from this more sort of tactical, this is an issue, that's an issue, that's an issue, to saying, I came here because I love this place. I'm worried about whether or not my kids are going to be able to stay here. I'm worried about whether this is a place I can stay. These are very different types of questions. So the values work is something that is really fundamental to the work that we do, and I think increasingly finding meaningful progress as it pertains to bringing our communities together. So let's talk a little bit more about why. One of the reasons why goes back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the obfuscation of facts. We talk about living in a post-fact society. So it's very hard to get people to agree on facts, but it's very possible to agree on values, right? So we may not agree on something specific related to the cause of our housing shortage, but we can absolutely agree that this should be a type of community where our kids, if they want to, have an opportunity to come back and live here. So it's an opportunity to explore what really matters. And it is also a space where we can have and share stories. Because when we're talking about our values, when we're talking about why we love a place, it immediately becomes a question of story. We're now telling and sharing stories with one another. And it is out of those stories that the values themselves emerge. And that sharing of stories, and we really try to orient this in a way where people are talking to each other, and very often, as we can, it's people you don't know. And it's small groups We like to do a maximum of 7 people. So it's a lot of meetings. I mean, if you're in my shoes, you're drinking a lot of coffee. It's a lot of trips. It's a lot of time on the ground. But over and over and over again, these small group conversations where people can talk to other people in their community, people who are different from them, and they can better understand how they're connected and what they share. Because again, so much of the way that we connect with one another is through what John Powell calls bonding, which is like, I'm a guy, you're a guy. I'm white, you're white. I'm middle class, you're middle class. I like recreation and mountain biking, you like mountain biking. And and that doesn't get us very far in this type of work. Bridging is the type of work we need to do where we're actually connecting across lines of difference. And again, those lines of difference can be varied. But this is the type of dialogue we can create to bridge, because we're hearing from other people who are different than us, who have different perspectives, but we're hearing about their concerns and their hopes and their fears within the context of their life and what matters most to them. And so what we find is we actually have a lot in common. And I can tell you, as a person who is probably just as troubled by our national dialogue as anybody, I mean, it's wild what's happening in terms of our democracy these days. This work, all I need to do is go, facilitate some values conversations to feel much, much better about where we are, because we do have more in common. And it's amazing. Even people that you would think you just couldn't even be in the room with them. You find that you actually can empathize with them. And that is a type of connection and relationship that is it's slow and steady work to rebuild and reconnect our communities. But that is the work that is going to position us to actually solve these problems. Because as long as we're sort of in our silos and we're playing the game against one another and against different perspectives, instead of figuring out a way that we can all agree on a shared vision for the future, shared priorities, shared direction, it's very hard. So these pieces of values is one of the reasons it's so difficult and are so important. And it's also really helpful because it lets us have more constructive conflict. Once we've arrived at a set of values, it doesn't make decisions for us. But what it does do is it allows us to focus on where the problem, where's the rub really? And you can say, I think what's really happening here is this is a tension between the value we have for being a family-friendly community, which means, we need to have these things true, and maintaining a small town character, which means these things should be true. And so this is a tension between, being a community of opportunity where everybody has an opportunity to thrive. And so I'm making those up, but that type of tension becomes much easier to look at it. So we can depersonalize it and we focus in on the issue and the value. Vision is the next stage. And I think a lot of times we think of vision as being kind of fluffy. I've almost never met a community that doesn't say, oh yeah, we've got a vision. And very rarely could I go if I went in and talked to people in a coffee shop, even if I spent an entire afternoon and asked them, do you have a solid sense of what the vision for this community is? They don't. And so the work of building a clear shared vision is extremely important and extremely valuable. And it is, like values, connects to story. Because again, this is how we move away from focusing on sort of a rear view mirror, looking in the past, and a grievance-based sort of perspective of tackling the issues, towards a forward-looking story that brings us all in, that asks us, what's possible if we do this together? And that reframing and that shifting is, as fluffy as it might sound, is extremely potent when it comes to actually making the conditions for change possible. And we've seen this over and over again. And this is what I can say. This work seems really fluffy and it seems really mushy, but the science is strong when it comes to engaging people in this way. It is very predictable that when we do it well, we do it right, and we collaborate effectively, you co-create, we have a type of communication that brings people in, that is empathetic, where we're learning together and we're problem solving together, the resulting strategies and actions, they get done. It's how we keep plans off the shelf. So I'll use an example, in terms of vision from some work we did in Taos, New Mexico. It was a community that was really struggling in terms of where it was headed and what it was trying to become. These are some kids we spoke to. And they were kind of known as like the difficult kids. You know, they were in a special program. I mean, I thought they were awesome. Turns out they really were awesome. But they had wonderful, unique, creative ideas for the future of their community. And they ended up working with us to actually, this is that group 4 or 5 months later in the next stage of the project, designing installations to show what that vision that they came up with, along with the rest of the community, could look like on the ground, and hosting an amazing multi-block community party that would illustrate and kind of pilot these concepts and ideas that was really focused on a downtown revitalization strategy. And the critical thing again is this is a group of people who felt disaffected, these kids, they felt disaffected. They had no desire to get involved at first. They weren't used to anybody listening to them. And suddenly here was a moment where people were asking them, we want to know what you think, and we want to know where you think this community can go. We want to know what you think the possibilities and potential are and how we can get there. And again, the potency of that in terms of building political will is amazing. And it came to a head one night when we were in a community meeting, and there was I was actually presenting some of the concepts and sort of an update on where the project was. And a man stepped up, and he was sort of a known, you know, fact checker, like sort of conspiracy theorist, but he envisioned himself more sort of like, I'm checking the facts, but also was always sort of throwing wild conspiracies into the mix. In any case, it was no problem. But he started sort of saying, you know, none of this is anything anybody wants. And one of these kids got up and was like, I've been going through this process. And he literally, the kid walked up and sort of said, look, I've been going through this process. I've seen our community have these conversations. I think we're going in the right direction. I understand that you're afraid of change, but this community is changing for me already. And I'm excited to be a part of this future that we're building together. And he turned around and he walked out of the room. And it was amazing the way he affected the dynamic in that place. And again, you know, this was a kid who wasn't used to being involved and suddenly became incredibly engaged in the process and in shaping a vision for the future and becoming not just a creator of that story, but a part of it. Then we move into sort of, you know, okay, we got a vision. How are we going to get there? And here again, I just want to reiterate the importance of this is also actually in Taos. This is one of our action planning teams. So, you know, for us anyway, this work is where you know, it's not like you just send the ideas again to the technical experts or a consultant and say, tell us how to do it. This is where we have the community roll up their sleeves and come up with the solutions. And it requires a lot of learning. And so there's a lot of time dedicated to understanding what are other communities doing, what can work here, and then problem solving together and problem solving with people that they disagree with. Because when we actually have to work with somebody that doesn't see the issue the same way we do, we're bridging. And we're forced to actually account for the ideas we have and listen to their ideas. And so this is a very, very powerful practice, again, that it really sort of takes this, we often use the word community-driven process. This is like, no, the community is going to drive it. And it can be nerve-wracking sometimes, I think, for local governments and local officials. But, and I've gotten in a lot of interesting conversations and arguments with our community partners who are, you know, the local officials are the ones who enter into the agreement with us. And they're like, I don't like the way this is going. This is terrifying me. And I say, you just got to trust your community and stick with me. And every time at the end, they realize that having the trust and the faith and letting go of that fear and allowing the community to be truly meaningfully involved in working through these things pays off. Just quickly talk about a couple places, and then I think we'll probably time to wrap up and jump in anytime if I'm running out of time. I can't see my my timer. I wanted to share Gunnison, Colorado, because I know while you guys are, you know, Bend is a city, you're also part of a region. And one of the things we have to recognize is that these problems, we can't effectively solve them locally. We have to work together as a region. And unfortunately, right now, a lot of the solutions we try to deploy are actually pretty parochial. And it's just the best we can do right now. I'll give you an example here in Glenwood. If you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna qualify for some of our deed restricted units, you have to work in Glenwood. And that's just not the way our market works. It's not the way our communities work. And if we were working more effectively as a region, we would recognize that, and all of the local governments and the institutions that are working on trying to solve this problem would say, let's figure out a way that we can house as many people as we can, as close as we can to their jobs, but also recognize that these are families and these are people who already have enough things challenging their ability to exist here. So let's not add one more on in terms of the instability related to their housing. So that's, one example of just sort of the parochialism that we see. And Gunnison was a place that sort of saw these challenges. We started working with them about 10 years ago, and they sent a team of leaders to one of our trainings and came out of that training with a recognition that, we're all over the place. And sort of what they realized is, we're a valley and our communities are connected and our future is connected. So we need to begin working together. And at the time, it was very, it was kind of us versus them, up valley, down valley. You're not doing enough. You're not doing enough. A lot of finger pointing. And so they began a process called the One Valley Prosperity Project, which was really two things at once. One, it was the region and the sort of the civic leadership coming together, public, private, nonprofit, the sort of grass tops leadership, and saying we need to dedicate ourselves to collaborating more effectively and building the structures and systems that allow us to do that, so that we can tackle these questions of housing and the economy and social health and equity, transportation, that are all so deeply connected. But also, we can't do that work effectively without meaningfully engaging our community. So there was a very strong grassroots community engagement effort that was really driving the whole thing, such that the sort of regional partners that started it could be taking their they could be following what the community wanted. And their goal was to, we're going to do better process than we've ever done. It's 10 years ago, so we'd all do it even better now. But it was a really good process, and it was really, valley-wide dialogue around the future, followed that basic framework I just shared with you. And it has had a striking impact on that region in terms of their ability to work together to solve the critical challenges that they are facing. And they have leaned into the collaborative sort of muscle and structures and even the mentality. Now everything is sort of under the One Valley sort of rubric. That's what they refer to a lot of their work. Is, this is a part of the One Valley work. And so it's really shifted the paradigm and approach to governance, but also across the valley at the local level within each individual community. It's had a significant impact on how they approach community engagement. And just this is just sort of an example of some recent work there. We came back in and after, again, it's been almost 10 years. They're now doing sort of a re-up on the original regional vision, and they are and this is just exciting to see them take on this work. And also talk now about sort of another community that is struggling in the context of how we tackle this kind of problem. I'm going to be as quick as I can, and maybe we can get into it a little bit in the questions. Steamboat Springs, about a couple of years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there's an anonymous donation to the local housing authority in order for the housing authority to buy around 500 acres of land. And a lot of work was done and the goal was to create affordable housing on it. Lots of work was done to create what was called the Brown Ranch project. And that project would have brought, over a course of, I think, about 30 years, 2,200 affordable housing units into essentially sort of a series of new neighborhoods at the west end of town within the urban growth boundary, but in an area that still needed to be annexed into the city. It became very contentious, and ultimately a voter petition put the question on the ballot. The annexation process ultimately was denied by the voters, and now we've been brought in to help bridge some of the divides that came out of that very contentious process within the community and help them find a pathway forward. And some of the things I want to share, just sort of what we're learning as ways of sort of thinking about how we can all do better. One, the process was a problem, well-intentioned, but it was designed from the get-go to sort of pit different sides against one another. And it was really a negotiation rather than a partnership. And the community became very confused and trying to figure out what side are we on, instead of something that was very collaborative and oriented around how can we work together to make this incredible opportunity happen. They were playing chess against each other. And so part of what we're doing with them is shifting that so that they're actually playing chess against the issues. And part of that too is a component of the bridge building work that we're doing to bring together the different sides that that really unfortunately became very divided during this process, and saying, you guys are gonna come together partly by understanding and listening to the concerns that the other side had, and partly by rolling up your sleeves, and you guys are gonna work on these problems together. But to do that effectively, we also need to create a dynamic where the community, which needs to understand this, needs to see it, but can't fundamentally be involved in every step of this very tactical process. So compared to sort of our other, the example of Gunnison or something that was very overall sort of community wide type engagement, this will include community wide engagement and reach out to everybody, but also it needs to kind of create what I'm thinking of, what we're calling like a fish tank, within which a smaller group of folks from different perspectives and walks of life in the community are going to be problem solving together, and they're going to represent a lot of the different perspectives, and they're certainly going to represent the different sides of the issue, and it's going to create a really a sort of visible lab for learning and problem solving as a community. And that's just getting started. We're actually working on that with one of your sponsors, Cascadia. So hopefully we'll have more to share on that as we go forward. But I want to go ahead and make sure we leave some time for questions. So thank you so very much for your time tonight.
Great. That was great, Clark. Thanks for that presentation. I learned a lot, and the process that you went through takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. I have a few questions to get us started with a conversation. I want to start with actually the second one on the list. You talk about a lot of strategies and tactics to engage the community to start resolving the solutions, and you talk about how broad opinions are. There's a organization here in Oregon called Oregon Values and Belief Centers, and they did a typology report that is, to your point, that it's not just progressive and conservative. They use many metric points to really paint a picture of who we are as Oregonians. And we did a lot of this work with our Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council as well, to ask those questions about Central Oregonians. And it is very interesting how diverse we actually are and how not so much, and in ways we don't think about. But as you work with people from very different backgrounds, some people who are new to this community, some people who've been here for a long time, we put these plans together to put the housing in, and then somebody says, yes, we believe in that. That's just such a great vision. But right there isn't where this thing should be built, because this is where I live. And let me tell you all the reasons why it doesn't work. So can you share with us some examples of, in particular, to affordable housing, how this has worked, how you've gotten the community to accept it in places that perhaps it hadn't been before, and what that looks like, what kind of methodologies you used to get those communities to be acceptable to that development in their neighborhood?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of the classic question, right? I mean, it sounds great. What happens when a real project comes along? And I think what we see, and you point this out pretty well, is that most of the time, we do put all this work in, we do a good plan, and it says the housing should go over there, and we, make sure the policies align with that. And then lo and behold, when it's time to build it, people are out of the woodwork, and just like you say, we get this oppositional reaction. And I think there's a couple things we need to really be aware of there. One is that when we engage in the planning work, most often, I don't think we're actually building the level of engagement and buy-in that we need to be able to sort of at least better ballast against that. Because I'm not going to say that the types of things we're talking about here and the ways that I've described some of this can completely take away opposition. I think it's something we're always going to have to navigate and manage. But when we do it effectively, we can build a sufficient level of community buy-in that the dynamics we have now, where you do all this planning work and suddenly it comes to a hearing and your local officials cave because 30 people show up and they're angry and suddenly all of those things go out the window. But when there's accountability to a process that was actually very substantive and they can point to that and it's understood and known, we all agree, we know this was a very substantive process. We know how much effort went into it. We know how much buy-in there is for it, and this is in line with that. It really does create a level of political will to change the sort of decision structures. So you asked for specific examples. One of the most recent ones is just the work we did in Silverton. It's a small town, little mountain town, and it's the type of place that they're not making anymore. It's a really cute little place, but it is changing quickly, like a lot of Colorado mountain towns, and it's becoming less affordable. And so they have housing needs. But there was a lot of resistance to infill in general, and really any type of housing, including affordable housing. And through the Silverton Compass project, we worked with the community through the methods that I mentioned, in a way that allowed for this sort of elevated and kind of progressive dialogue. And by progressive, I just mean it progressed. We moved along. And brought people along, and they brought themselves along, because like I said, we're not dragging them along, we're just a guide, to a place where there was strong support for what needed to happen and recognition. And that doesn't mean people liked it. There's a lot of people who are still like, I wish it didn't come to this, but I get it now and I feel listened to. I had a chance to sort of share my concerns, and now they're making meaningful progress. They've gone straight into a code revision to enable the things in the plan. That's happening, and there's projects that are coming out of the ground that are actually not causing a lot of pushback. So, I think that's an example. I think in other places, I mentioned Gunnison. Well, the town of Crested Butte and Gunnison County are right in a sort of a test case of this right now as well. There's a project that's at just outside of Crested Butte. That's a workforce housing project called Whetstone. And it's controversial, but the process is leaning into the work that was done through the One Valley work and the relationships, both in terms of the collaborating partners, the city and the county, but also the community involvement and vision that was created. And so while there is certainly some pushback, it hasn't been the type of pushback that's more recently. There was some initial pushback that was really becoming untenable, but as they've sort of leaned back into the structures that they've created through their One Valley work, I think it's really enabled them to have a clear path forward.
I'm going to go with that last couple examples that you gave. We had a question come in that really speaks to how many years it takes to make those code changes and to make the adjustments in order for you to manifest a place where everybody can live. So how do you handle situations where a community comes together on support for housing projects, but those outdated codes may inhibit the projects due to lack of city staff, resources, and whatever other barriers are up? So you've talked about it. You have finally agreement on something on perhaps an area that codes need to be updated, and there's something in the way of doing it. How do you deal with that?
Well, so kind of two questions in one, and one is the question of how long does this work take and to get done, and the other is sort of how do you actually work through the specific implementation dynamics, right? So the first part is, I think in a way the most critical one, which is this is ongoing, never-ending work, and that's one of the things we need to shift in terms of the paradigms we have for how we engage and make decisions at the local level. When we think about stronger civic capacity, the type of civic capacity that lets us make better decisions and actually implement meaningful, projects and policies that are at the scale of the problem, this is stuff that you can't just sort of stop and start because we started a plan. It needs to be ongoing. What you guys are doing tonight is a really good example of it. We just need more of it. It needs to be bigger. It needs to be more than the people who kind of are on the same page. But it's a component. This is one ingredient of it. And I'm not saying these conversations need to be bigger. I'm saying it's this plus a lot of other things. So I like to think about that sometimes as like an individual. A person can't sort of wake up one morning, have a vision, get themselves into a routine, and do that for 2 months in terms of, here's how I'm going to manage my time, exercise, work, want to be a good father, all of these things, and then stop the underlying sort of work they were doing as an individual around clarity of vision and who do I want to be and how am I going to do it, and the consistency of those routines, and expect to sort of be the person they were actually hoping to be. So we have to do this in an ongoing way. It doesn't start and stop when the plans come along, because otherwise we get into this dynamic where we're really making decisions at the hearings, and that's not the way to do it, right? We don't want to make it so that we sort of have a planning framework, but really people know if you want to affect change, you go to the hearing, and that's not fair and it doesn't work. So the other question there is, okay, well, what do you actually do? And I think, unfortunately, to sort of move the policy change forward, that's a pretty contextually specific question. What I can tell you works very well, or some of the components, I guess, is it needs to continue to be this type of problem-solving approach. One of my favorite folks to work with on this actually is Cascadia and Alex Joyce, and I know he's a board member there. They've created some really wonderful tools that allow communities to, roll up their sleeves, open up the hood, and play around with what happens if they make an adjustment this way or that way on their setbacks. And they also understand how the multiple dimensional standards and all the different standards that sort of affect what actually can be built on the ground interplay with one another, because that's, the other types of things that can get really difficult in this. And so that is the approach that I think we need, is to sort of, it's problem solving, it's engaging people in that. There, you go online just today, another like zoning code toolkit came online from Smart Growth America. I mean, between all the different, and it's great. I'm not saying that's not good work. It's great work, but there's a ton of information out there on the sort of how. The question, again, I don't think is a question of, I think it's a process question. And it really does ask us, like, how do we use processes that meaningfully bring the people that are going to be oppositional or might have meaningful critique. That's the other thing. We can't always think of people as opposition. We actually have to take some of these concerns at face value and say, you know what? I'm not going to call this person a NIMBY anymore. You can be a YIMBY. That's good. Yes, in my backyard, good. But let's also acknowledge that while there are some truly bad actors as it pertains to opposition to housing, there's also a lot of people, and we're seeing this in Steamboat, that have fair and legitimate criticisms. And when we kind of push all of them into a single group and say those people are oppositional, and then we start labeling them with things, you're racist, or it doesn't help. It's not building a sense of belonging, because belonging goes both ways. It's not only about making it so that those who are marginalized feel that they belong. It's also people that feel like they're being, pigeonholed as other for being racist or whatever. And I know this is a change. This is a different framework from a lot of what we've been thinking about within the DEI space, but it's an important shift that I think is going to make it so that we can begin moving more together, as opposed to sort of, again, playing chess against each other. I hope, the problem with the specific policy changes thing is a very contextual question, but I hope that got at a little bit of it.
Yep, it is very contextual, and we're certainly going through a lot of that here. So I'm noticing you're developing some evangelists and admirers from this presentation, and they're asking how somebody with an architectural background and a passion to be involved in affordable housing, how can you get involved in processes like this? I know from my standpoint, there are a few places where you can insert yourself into a conversation. The City of Bend is probably a great place to start. They have an affordable housing committee, and can't remember if there's an opening right now. I saw a list of different committee openings, but that is a great space to get involved in. And you can go to the City of Bend's website and look under their committees and sign up for that. There's another organization called Envision Bend that has been working for a couple of years now on what Bend will look like by 20, 30, 40, 50. And there are a lot of opportunities there to get involved, especially on housing, because surprise, surprise, that was one of the biggest issues that our community is saying we need to deal with together. So Envision Bend is a great way to insert yourself. A lot of employers are getting involved in very, very different ways in this. If you're an employer, you work for an organization, and you want to become a part of the Chamber's Workforce Housing Initiative, we have places for folks there. So there are a lot of ways you can plug in the community, neighbor impact, et cetera, of bringing ideas and bringing people together. And I think it's great that folks are asking how to get involved. You're being very inspiring this evening, Clark. So I want to ask a question that kind of lands a real example. Again, I know you gave a bunch of them, but
That's okay.
we all know and we share your pain in Colorado of being an awesome place to live. And the land's expensive, the building materials are expensive, labor is expensive. It's just hard to pull these things off. It takes intentionality and commitment and money that goes along with all this good work that you're doing to get people on the same page. Can you give an example of a creative problem solving project where the work that you do was kind of married up with a really great creative solution that through your process was acceptable to the community, and you also found a sustainable or a creative way to fund that vision? Would love to hear an example of that.
Yeah, sure. So, just first to speak very briefly to the sort of fundamental dynamic is, so that everybody's on the same page. When we have one of the things about building housing is the price difference between like there's no price difference between an affordable nail and a market rate nail, or an affordable piece of plyboard and so what it costs to build a home is what it costs to build a home. And when you add those costs up and then you want to try to make a project that is actually going to be below market, so it costs less than what the market would actually bear, there's going to be a gap. And we have to fill that gap. And that's where subsidy comes in. And there's a lot of people that question the idea of subsidy. We don't need to get into that right now. I think for this audience, we understand that is fundamental part of making dedicated affordable housing possible. So we came to that conclusion. I'll use an example here in my hometown of Glenwood Springs. Our community was coming to this conclusion a couple of years ago, and the city manager at the time had the sort of vision to say, we need dedicated source of funding. Like we can see this isn't going to get any better. We don't have the funding, and asked us to come in and help essentially create an ad hoc community task force focused on addressing the question of, how can we create dedicated resources for the community? And we approached that with the same type of, fundamentally the same ideas that I've been talking about today, which is a lot of learning and co-creation, asking people in that group what we needed to learn about. And the design of the group was intentionally created to really reflect the demographic and social makeup of Glenwood Springs, and political makeup too. So we really tried to bring in a pretty diverse group of people, business and residents, and all the different folks that live here. And that group worked together pretty tirelessly for several months and came back with a lot of analysis. I mean, we looked into, we analyzed different funding options. Almost all of them turned out to be increase in some portion of our local tax. So for Colorado, that can be sales tax, it can be property tax, it can be lodging tax. There's a few different options you have. We analyzed that as a group, that group did the work. I didn't come in and do it as a consultant. And we came back with a set of recommendations, and that group did the work of defining what the vision was, what the goals are, what would be possible. And I was there to sort of be, I was a platform for their ideas. I was a scribe. I was helping them organize it. I was facilitating them. But it was really important that this group of people, which included people that were non-native speakers, was able to come together and connect with one another and build the relationships that would put them in a place where whatever they came up with was solid. And it turned out that the thing that what made sense was a lodging tax. Fortunately, we had brought in into that group members of the lodging community. And this is where it shifts a little bit from, our normal, we don't normally do campaign work, and we couldn't hear, but we had positioned this group to be able to go into what would become a really successful campaign to raise taxes in Glenwood, to create a dedicated workforce housing fund. And so, the answer there is, again, that sort of we had to build the buy-in. There needed to be a vision. Then we had to go, in this case, we had to sell that vision to the larger community. But that included a lot of community workshops, learning and understanding. And so we've since worked with some other places. There's another area in Southwest Colorado, La Plata County, who we sort of help them think about the same model and how they wanted to do an even larger sort of approach in terms of the engagement and how to really orient it around a story for what the community could be, but with the intention of trying to find a way to create the funding needed. So the tricky thing with funding, of course, is it's inherently political, and you have to, at least in Colorado, for the most part, you're going to have to pass some type of tax measure by the voter. So it always becomes a political thing, which is a little different. I mean, all of this work is political, of course, but it's a little different than sort of the community visioning and strategy work that we do, where a lot of the implementation work doesn't require then sort of going to the voters. But in a way, going to the voters is a really nice reflection of, did we do this right? And we get the support we need? Did we follow the process right? And did it go 100% and everybody in Glenwood wanted to pass it? No. But we built sufficient levels of community buy-in that it did pass. And again, we found later with lesser processes, I already mentioned in my opening story, that our community then kind of reverted back to a more anti-housing stance. And I have, without going into it, I think a big part of that is that our community hasn't done a good enough job on clarifying its vision for where we want to go. Having a meaningful grown-up conversation about how we're going to change and what we want to be when we grow up, that would allow us to, in a contextualized way, fit that little Habitat for Humanity or project into something that makes sense for people. And so absent that vision and shared understanding of where we're going, those things are really scary, and you're going to fight it.
Yep. I appreciate that. Intentionality was a word that I heard you use a lot, and I use that a lot when we talk about trying to build a robust place where everybody can live. It is not easy, and it takes a long time. And I appreciate you referring to also the funding issue, both on the state and the local level. As I shared in the very beginning, there's a lot going on, but it never seems to be enough. I want to thank you so much I know you're not feeling well, and it's such a bummer to have to give a presentation when you feel like crap. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
I'm glad I didn't have a spasm, like.
And thank you for not sharing that with all of us. Really appreciate it tonight, and appreciate everyone online. And I'm going to turn this back over to Nicole.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katy. Thanks again to both of our guests, Katy and Clark. Your presentation was very inspiring this evening, and we're so happy that you joined us. I would like to also recognize again our title and presenting sponsors, Hayden Homes, Pahlisch Homes, and Pinnacle Architecture, and all of our sponsors that made this free event possible. Tonight's lecture has been recorded and will be available on our website very soon. And also stay tuned for our 2025 lecture series. We're working on that now and hope to get an announcement early in the new year. Thank you for joining us for this inspiring event, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.